Great. All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome. This is our last Design at Large and course session for spring 2021. Today closes out our series, Racism in the Design of Everyday Things, which began in the winter quarter. We are so lucky to have Stephen Wakabayashi, who will be giving a talk entitled Designing for Equity, Creating More Inclusive and Accessible Products. Stephen is the co-founder of QT BIPOC Design, an organization that provides free and accessible design education, mentorship, and networking opportunities for LGBTQ+ designers of color. After leading creative teams on some of the biggest brands, including Apple, Salesforce, Sephora, Mercedes-Benz, and Samsung, he is now dedicating himself to bring more diversity and equity to creative teams around the world. As Stephen mentioned, he's also a UCSD alum. And Stephen, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. Let me share my screen. Let me enable chat. So I have the chat open on my screen. If anyone has any questions as I walk through this presentation, feel free to ping that. We'll also allocate time at the end of the discussion to answer any other question as we do. Yes. Thank you for the land acknowledgement. And I am based here in New York City, also known as Lenape Territory, providing acknowledgement for that community that we have colonized. Really excited to have a discussion with you all. Like what Liz said, my name is Stephen. I lead an organization called QT BIPOC Design, recently founded last year. After being in the creative industry for a long time, diversity has been a huge factor of pain point for myself, and especially in the height of BLM and just seeing a lot of things happening in the space, decided to take action on it. And I've taught many UX courses as well in the past, and we have seen a lot of movement in the tech industry to create more equity by increasing headcount. But unfortunately, as we talk about the people who do enter the space, / also thinking about the people who exit the space, unfortunately, when we don't have equitable culture and we don't empower folks in marginalized communities to be able to be educated and take the position, we aren't still able to establish equity. So really, this organization's mission is to increase the level and the amount of folks within the queer and BIPOC community with education of UX and design. And so a little bit of just how did we get here, right? Talked a little bit about my passion and my reasoning of creating this organization, but just what's happening in the design landscape. So AIGA does this annual survey with Google assessing what's up with tens of thousands of designers. And overall, as we take a look at what the data and some of the insights come up, as we take a look at the demographics of the design industry, we see that the numbers are really unchanged since 2016, indexing primarily white folks and Asian folks, with much fewer Latinx and Black X folks. And the percentage with the Asian population is also another point of debate, especially as we talk about Asian as a whole represented in the United States. And so this survey is also a United States survey. We have 6% in the United States, but we see 9% represented in design. But the movement in the industry is also disaggregating Asian population as a whole to identify demographics of East versus Southeast versus other parts of Asia, so that we can achieve equity across different domains. As we talk about female representation too, interestingly enough, we had 61% of responders who are female, but as we work our way up towards leadership, we see a huge decline. And there are many things such as the 3% conference, which was founded understanding that there were only 3% of women in creative director position. And as we talk about LGBTQIA representation, we also see in the survey that on average earn half than those that were not LGBTQIA+. And lastly, diversity is an important issue. It comes up again and again in the survey. And while it might be good, right, to understand, yes, designers have this on top of mind, it also means that we need to do something about it. It is on top of mind because it is still a huge issue within our industry. And before we get started, just want to set the baseline with some of these terminologies, right? You might have heard diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging is another one, justice is another one. I really like justice integrated into the mix because you get the acronym JEDI, J-E-D-I, which is really fascinating. I love it. But these three terminologies show up time and time again, and just a rough delineation between them, right? Diversity is just the quantitative means of how many different perspectives show up in a room. Inclusion is really how we welcome these different perspectives in terms of what we might do with the programming, the spaces we create. And equity is also very different from inclusion in the aspect equity is really the distribution of power. And power can mean many different things, right? Attention, money, titling. And so as we talk about just some of these terminologies, one of the ways we can establish equity is to use these terms appropriately when we talk about spaces that we have. So as we talk about the space that we have today, and we want to make it more equitable overall as a whole, we have to ask ourselves, is it diversity, right? Getting different perspectives in the room? Is it inclusion, making people feel more welcome through different means? Or is it the distribution of power through attention, money, different resources that exist? So I found this graphic on the interwebs that's really an interesting way also of showcasing the differences between these terms. And so on the very left, we have an image that shows three people standing next to each other in a baseball field, and they're looking over a fence, but they're of different heights. And so unfortunately, the shortest person is not able to see past the fence to look at what's happening in the baseball game. But because they're different heights, underneath we say the label, this is diverse, right? When we talk about inclusion, the example here in the picture, we have three people with the fence gone, and they're also wearing the same uniform. So this is a way of different approaches and programming that might allow people to feel more welcome into the space and to also potentially partake. And then the last part with equity, this is again, distribution of power, distribution of resources. And to create equity, it is so that we might be able to give little boosters to those shorter than the fence, so they're able to see past it and to partake in the baseball game along with other folks. And then when we talk about design, right? Oh, design, we love it so much, but unfortunately it hasn't done a great job overall, right? And so we have seen design time and time again show up in the news, not in a great light. We've seen AI discriminate against those folks with different colors in terms of even content on social media platforms, right? We've seen it prioritize those who are light-skinned or content, preferring those with more power, money, status. And even as we talk about form fields, right? I was signing up for another Gmail account the other day and it was asking me for a gender. And I was like, let's back up. What part of gender needs to go into how I consume email, right? And so what's really interesting is in the conversation design, sometimes we get so caught up in inclusivity, like, oh yeah, ask for different options, but rarely do we just take a step back and ask ourselves, especially as it pertains to data, is it necessary, specifically in this experience? And so a lot of stuff, especially in design that's happening, is able to provide us with a way that we can start to understand and think about ways that we're creating so we can put out into the world products that are more mindful of our consumers. And so the first lesson is design is ultimately both the expected outcome and unexpected consequences. A lot of the times we'll say, yeah, this is what we expected, but we didn't expect that to happen, right? And point over there. but actually as designers, we have to take full responsibility of both parts of these. And when we start taking it into consideration, then this is when we can start making a shift into the way we talk about design and the way we talk about iteration for equity. And as we talk about different design models, so here on the screen, we have 3 different design thinking methodology frameworks up. Um, I'm not going to go too in depth with this one, and I'll show more methodologies later, but the thing about design methodologies that we've studied and understood for so many of the years, as we think about equity, it didn't do so well, particularly because this centers the designer still in the center of all of this, acting as a godlike figure that somehow is able to assess, study all of the world, and somehow is able to understand exactly what the world needs, right? And especially as we think about community-driven initiatives, insights, and design, we must bring the people around us into the processes. And so really what I'm loving with the movement of racial equity is really thinking through how are we integrating people into the processes? And so a couple organizations, and there's so many people who are doing really amazing work that I'll highlight in this talk. It's just National Equity Project, Creative Reaction Lab, and Project Inkblot. There's so many other organizations doing amazing things, but just to kind of share a little bit about what they're doing that I highly recommend everyone to check out is the model in which they recommend designers to think through designing. And we also, as an organization, QT BIPOC Design, we're also creating our own model as well so that we can think through design through a different lens. And the first one I will share, the National Equity Project. On the left, we have a typical design thinking model. And on the right, with an arrow pointing to it, we have an updated model that integrates 2 additional pieces, notice and reflect. So what's really beautiful about this model that's created by the National Equity Project, which what they call liberatory design, is the opportunity to add a brief moment of pause in design so that we're able to reflect and to acknowledge what's going well for our community, what's not going well, what are some insights, and baking in what is typically the retrospective, right? When we would meet together at the end of a project into the design processes itself, which is reflect. And the notice portion of it to add into design thinking model is for us to become more cognizant of different dynamics that exist around us, whether it's within internally with ourselves, which is our biases, right? Within other people, which could be their own biases or their different contexts that they exist within the community with one another, or just a larger community, right? And different dynamics that play in there, which could include power dynamics. It could include different ways of collaboration and how we share different power dynamics within that setting as well. In the model of Creative Reaction Lab, what I will add is the thinking around how do we put history, the context of history into our design thinking model, right? So on the left here, we see 3 circles, one saying design-based problem solving, the second says equitable outcomes, the third saying community development. And in the middle of these 3 circles, it says ECCD, which stands for equity-centered community design. And so this is really the foundation of their design thinking model. And on the right here, there's a bunch of different pieces. I won't get into the detail, which you can definitely check out with Creative Reaction Lab. But the things that are highlighted with this that are different is thinking about how do we leverage context of history, whether it's history of a community, right? Especially as we think about land acknowledgements that we're providing of indigenous nations and unceded tribes, also thinking about the history of projects that we've created, right? Too often, we're so focused on dismantling what exists to rebuild from scratch that we forget of all the lessons that had gone into it to create what we have today. And again, right, design is the result of intended and unintended consequences. If we're able to understand the little pieces that have gone into it, right, the ingredients to create the outcome, we can then understand how we move forward. Imagine cooking from scratch every single time with a blindfold on, right? Or if you're making this recipe and something just tasted slightly off, and you're like, absolutely done, we're finished, never trying this dish ever again, right? Let's make it completely from scratch with these ingredients. What went well? What didn't go well, right? We have no learning, and yet we do the same in design all the time. In psychology, there's a little layer of ego that sits in there, right? Where we're like, like I have to own it. It is mine. And in terms of liberatory design and community-centered design, it's letting some of that go so we can let other people into the process. In the work of Project Inkblot, there are processes. So here in the screen, we have 5 different steps with different illustrations. And I would just highlight a couple things here that's different maybe from the past few slides is this concept of also, I love their definition they produce on the very first chart on the left, which says intent versus impact. Intent is what we hope to achieve versus impact, what we actually did. And so too often we index so heavily on intent when the impact was not exactly what we wanted. They're like, but we thought about it. But at the end of the day, right, as we talk about design, the intended and unintended consequences, we have to take responsibility of what happened. And in terms of impact, if we aren't taking responsibility for impact, but we love the intent, where are we really going to go, right? The next part is, I'll just go one by one. We have plenty of time to do so. What is your role in the team and how does this play in perpetuating biases, right? So they actually have a practice in Inkblot to actually understand taking inventory of who's on the team and doing an assessment of what do you bring to the table, right? Which is great, understanding people's specialties, people's lived experiences that could be really interesting, but also understanding the gaps that exist. And then using that gap to then look towards a community to help fulfill it. And they provide a really interesting way of also inviting the community in, of asking them, not just, hey, I want to learn from you, but presenting them with the opportunity of, if we work together in a collaborative manner, how can we make this a win for you? So allowing the individuals to actually define what the relationship would look like, the relationship of collaboration. And again, in terms of defining what is our intention versus impact, they say target source is the intentional demographic, right? This is our persona, quote unquote. And then the excluded source is oftentimes the people that are a part of our unintended consequence, right? And so as we start to give these things words that happens within the context of design, we can start to create solutions that address this. And then the last two, inviting others to be a part and define their own role. So, I skipped ahead, apologies. So that was where you invite other collaborators into the space to then define what would a win look like for them? What would collaboration look like for them? And then the last part, how does this process continue iteratively and equitably? So the last part in their process, which they call designing for diversity, is to add the concept of iteration into it so that we can continue to work and create solutions. Also adding collaboration still as a proponent pillar to it. And then for our model that we're creating internally, in terms of how we think equity shows up, we also believe equity is the relationship we have, not just with us, but with others and our work. So adding on top of the different models that we've developed, our view and our perspective leans a little bit more into mindfulness. And mindfulness is really how we hold space for concepts and others, right? And so in our model, we have very different ways, and we won't go too into depth of many other parts because they really do are inspired by other pieces, is to think about how we hold space for ourselves, how we hold space for our community, our peers, and also how we hold space for our work, and how we can bring equity into each of those relationships. And so the really interesting thing that has bubbled up that we haven't really seen, that we absolutely love, is this concept of creating what we call safe spaces in design. And we have a couple pillars of insights that we would like to share with you all. It is first establishing spaces that are free of judgment and identifying what that might look like, right? So as we talked about these individual points of relationship, right? Us with ourselves, us with our community, our peers, and our work, how do we make each of those relationship points judgment free, right? Also with our work, right? It is truly a relationship, especially, right? As we think about artists and work, this what does it look like to be judgment free with our work, and this concept of perfectionism we hold, right? Oftentimes perfectionism is defined as having a single source of truth that is the most perfect, right? But as we think about power, establishing equity, and distributing it, we also have to understand perfectionism cannot exist, right, in that model, because there is no single source of truth. There is no single perfection. And so, how do we hold a space that is free of perfection for not just our work, also for our community and our peers as well? The next step is how do we create emptiness, right, that may be filled by others? So too often we are so busy filling the space with ourselves, our thoughts, and everything that we have to put into a container that exists, that we forget to create space for other things, such as other ideas, other people. And so a couple pieces of advice that we'll provide for you is thinking about what does it look like to provide space in a digital medium, right? How do we create emptiness within the digital medium? Sometimes it can show up as after we create a presentation, and I'll share this deck with you all afterwards. So I totally forgot to remind you all of that, so you don't have to like feverishly take notes. The emptiness could show up as we provide content for people to access after an event or after a meeting, so they could digest separately on the side, right? Emptiness could show up as just slowing down when we're doing talks and discussion. It could show up as just silence, offline, physical space, so that people can be inspired to bring themselves, their ideas into the space. And then the last part is inviting healthy ideas and banter and what we call braveness in this aspect. And so oftentimes we are also in the space where we want to put in a thought and have it celebrated by everyone, which is great. We love to have a pat on the back, but we forget that different perspectives may not necessarily align one to one, and it's okay. And so the advice here that I will provide is if you're in a situation where everything aligns and everything is the same, maybe assign a devil's advocate role to somebody so that they can poke holes or be invited to poke holes in it, especially in a situation where we even have a power dynamic where you have a boss, right? Or even a C-level executive presenting to other folks who may be afraid to lose their jobs. They in turn don't feel the opportunity to provide their perspectives, especially if it plays counter to the narrative that's coming from top down. And so in that situation, sometimes when we invite different perspectives in, we actually might just have people expressing the truths. Yeah. Angela says, Creative Reaction Lab and Project eBlock are brilliant, offer free webinars. Yep, definitely check that out. And Julie mentioned George IA talks about his traumatic experience without culture of safety or safe spaces. Yes, Absolutely. So we can create it in therapeutic sense, right? So why don't we also create this within design? So these are a bunch of different models. And again, there is not a single source of truth. Also, we work with so many different peoples across so many different projects, right? With so many different constraints. And you're all super aware, right? Things are due, like things need to get done. At the same time, this work of being conscious, mindful, and bringing the community in also shows up in so many different ways. So I invite you all to explore these different models and different tools and see what might work best for your different situations. Maybe explore creating your own model that might be best for your situation and sharing that with the world. And so, with all of this, we'll share with you a bunch of different projects that I've been able to pull from the internet, that I've seen, that I've worked on, that will inspire you to think maybe outside the box as we think about creating different products and designs into the world. So the first example is establishing equity through just diversity, right? Quantitative means. So there's so many ways of addressing this, and I really love seeing the movement with different companies that are, for once, like establishing the concept within their own work that people are come in all different shapes and sizes, right? So just as it pertains to even skin color, there's such a huge range. And how many years, right, did it finally take for band-aids to finally come in skin colors that were not of this like beige kind of like pastel like yellow tone, right? Very rarely. They may have made clear, but we all know clear is not really clear. It just shows up as this like weird gloss thing on your arm, right? And sometimes they're like very protruding. But anyway, they've started to dive into this work of celebrating, creating equity, right, in terms of their product. Um, as we take a look at makeup and skincare, such a huge movement in that space. Fenty broke down barriers when they created a concealer shade that came in 50 colors. And especially as we think about how we create designs and products, we're always, again, in this tension, right? Tug and pull of we want to create a product, go to market immediately, but also we want to be conscientious. Again, there is not a single one size fits all solution. And again, think about an iterative process, right? As we saw from Project Inkblot, yes, you can definitely start with smaller market and expand outwards, but also remind yourself this process is always iterative, right? We may understand that in the future, maybe 50 shades is not even enough, that we also need more shades. And this work that Angelica Das had done, Humane, I actually highly recommend everyone to check out, started mapping out all the different types of folks with their skin tone and put them across different Pantone colors. It's actually quite beautiful, has been in different museums. I actually was on one of the exhibits, I took a picture, but it's just beautiful, beautiful work celebrating different perspectives and diversity and making art with it in design. Um, as we talk about different startups, even companies that are entering the market, we start acknowledging intersectional identities and the representation that has to have in terms of products and offerings, right? As we think about service design being service design, right? Service, I do something for you, you do something for me. Design, being creative with that, right? We can also think about bringing diversity, equity into that model. And so there are so many different startups doing awesome work in that space, right? Queerly Health, making health LGBTQ first, as we think about health as it pertains to those who are non-binary or trans that might not fit within some of these binary models that exist, are unfortunately excluded from typical care. Also, a great opportunity for healthcare practitioners to flag themselves as folks who want to celebrate and work with more diverse patients. We see Fluid doing awesome work again, along with Fenty in the space of ensuring that makeup is not just for those who identify and label themselves as more femme centric, right? Women, um, but makeup being for everyone in terms of the way they do casting, photo shoots, and just advertisements. You see so many different perspectives, different sizes, different colors. And then Daylight is doing a lot of work within the fintech space to establish equity, whether it's through the concept of allowing people to allow them to pick their own chosen name to go on the debit card, to getting financial consultation that is more specific to LGBTQ perspectives as well. And the concept of internet intersectionality is really this concept of how different perspectives, as they intersect, will need different services based off of that. And so all of us attending this call, we are the summation of many, many, many different intersectionalities. And in that, we aren't going to have a one size fits all solution. And so, this concept of disaggregation, this decoupling of this one product that fits everyone into all these different pieces is actually a great thing to offer more catered services towards people with different perspectives and backgrounds. Again, the concept of equity could show up through freedom of choice, like we just mentioned, different products, and also this huge movement of allowing people to have choice over different concepts that we've had in the past. One being name, right? Um, Especially in name that we don't even get to pick, right? As we are born and brought into this world that we must carry, and sometimes carry, again, like design, intended and unintended consequences, right? Sometimes gender is layered in it, um, allowing people the means to break away from that. And how can we design that and design systems to help uplift folks being able to choose things that really don't have a huge impact on other aspects of their lives, right? Um, Maybe we're just creating designs by allowing people to share the lived experience. So there's 3 projects here that I will share. One is a red table project that was created that brings together all folks from different perspectives to sit together, to dine, to share different perspectives. Or is it the project of middle ground, where they bring together contentious voices, not just voices of different people, but voices of people that have battled in the past. And they created a very powerful video bringing together Asian folks with Black folks to talk about some of the biases that they hold with one another. While very raw, I think being able to touch at this very deep core matter is just an absolutely beautiful opportunity to start breaking down some of the walls that hold us away from each other. And then another great project, Vibe Switch, was an art installation. So the image on the right shows an image where people are gathering near a wall, walking towards it. And on the wall, there's prompts. One prompt asking people to write in how others have stereotyped them as. And another prompt asking, but in reality, dot, 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 I am, to really break away from the stereotypes that people have put upon us, but also the beauty of putting some of the things that have hurt us to allow it to be informative for other folks so that they can be more equitable and inclusive. Or could it just show up as education in some of the designs that we see? Sometimes we have all these social media posts and channels, and just so much is happening. And I actually love some of the work that people are doing to simplify the work of equity and inclusivity, diversity, and one of it being Anti-Racism Daily. And Nicole does an awesome, awesome job putting together insights into little tangible bite-sized nuggets that people can take with them throughout the day. Is it just showing up simply as Yelp and Google have done, showing what type of business owners are behind the products that you see, the restaurants that you see, the places that you go? Is it Asian owned, Black owned, Latinx owned? And then lastly, is it just something that's really fascinating, interesting? So there's this company called Q Space, this space that exists, and one of their projects was called coded plumbing. And so the image on the right is this vector illustration of the bathroom with a bunch of different signs, and we're located in the bathroom. So there's a toilet seat holder, or sorry, the accessible handrail, toilet paper holder, sink, hand dryer, and they talk about all the different decisions that go into understanding how to make a bathroom more inclusive. Yeah. Another part of design, which I really love, is as we understand communities and understand the needs of the communities, the output can show up very differently from how we might have seen different models work in the past. And so the examples that I have here on the screen show chat interfaces where anonymity is on the forefront. And so on the left, we have this group called the QChat space that created these anonymous chats, anonymous group chats that happen multiple times throughout the month where people can attend, and there is no face, there is no label, there's nothing intended to label people, to show people's faces, just voices, so that people can be a part of a conversation without having to worry about maybe the biases that they may stir up in other people. This other company called Huddle now is, I'll tell you what they've turned into, but Huddle initially started as a chat application for the LGBTQ community to access mental health. And so on the right, we have screenshots from the application. And in two of the screenshots, we see people's faces completely pixelated. And you can actually choose the degree of pixelation based on how comfortable you were feeling about when you were connected with other folks in the space as you shared about your needs or wants, just talking about mental health. Really cool concept. And they ended up pivoting into an application called Supergreat, which is a makeup review application platform. Oh, whoopsies, we rewinded. Or does equity just show up as language? And so sometimes as we talk about words and phrases, we forget that there's a lot of context behind it, especially hundreds and hundreds of years of social inequity and the work of redistributing power comes also through the form of dismantling some of the structures that we've had in place. One of it being some of the words that we use to describe. On the left, we have this product called Clue that removes gender from their platform. So Clue is a period menstrual tracking application. And this concept of also gender, right? Gender is a norm of that is a binary of a man and a woman. Male and females exist. And in some of the language we talk about menstruation and periods and how they're for women, sometimes doesn't necessarily align with those who may be trans, maybe non-binary, that also experience menstruation, right? Just because they experience something doesn't necessarily mean that they are these gender norms that have been attributed to it. And so the really great work that they're doing and then they're putting out there is just helping to educate people on ways that we can be more inclusive with our language, especially as it pertains to menstruation and observing our cycles of the month. And the lesson that they've pushed on different channels that I actually love, and it's just really short and sweet, is this concept that our bodies do not determine our identities, that how we are born is not necessarily how we identify as. Um, and some people might debate it here and there, but at the end of the day, where I personally stand is just being able to give people the freedom to express themselves as they truly wish to be expressed, um, is a really beautiful thing. And the more we can celebrate this, we bring so much more beauty, so much more self-expression. And as we talk about design, right? The design is the beauty of self-expression. We must vigilantly uphold this in the spaces that we create. And then on the right, so Google recently launched an update to their Docs platform. And one of it is this update that is coming that's going to address some language use and make it more inclusive. And so they'll provide some tidbits and some facts and some advice powered through artificial intelligence that as you type different things in their platforms, it'll give you recommendations of different words to opt into instead. So the example that we see on the screen here, somebody's typing a sentence that says, get approval on budgets from budget committee chairman, and you see a little modal pop up that's recommending them to use more inclusive language, to use chair or chairperson instead of chairman. Cool. Just a couple more examples. Sometimes equity can show up as more design patterns, right? So more different models to think about design. We have the persona spectrum that was coined by Kat Holmes, who was previously a principal designer at Microsoft, and Microsoft's taken and hailed a lot of this work. But it is this concept that there are these different states that people exist within, especially as it pertains to disability, which is beautiful the way she phrases it. Disability can show up as something that's temporary, something that's permanent, or something that's situational. And that as we design and having different lenses, we can be more conscientious of where everyone, how people can enter and experience a design. And as we think about these different situations, just because, right, somebody is suffering through a permanent physical disability doesn't mean we will never experience something similar, right? Imagine when we break our leg, we go through a situational or a temporary physical disability. Even cognitive disability, as we talk about people who might not be good at reading, right? Because their cognition with words might not be as quick, can also show up in people traveling different countries, right? Like, oh my God, it's like hieroglyphics, right? Like when I travel, I'm like, what does everything say? And we oftentimes forget to equate some of these things as similar, some of these things having similarity. And so really the beautiful work of inclusion, creating products that address disabilities and different spectrums of it, we actually end up creating products that improves the experience for everyone else. And then made by If. If is an agency in the UK doing awesome, awesome work. One of it being this data patterns catalog that they've created that helps people to address dark patterns within design. And then just to wrap up, maybe equity can just show up as simple manifestos that we sign on to. And so here are two examples of manifesto, one called Society-Centered Design and one called Designing Mindfulness, that outlines various principles that they follow with their work that folks can also opt into. Definitely highly recommend people to check that out as well. And so the last kind of tidbit to share with everyone is hope these examples were inspirational to see how people used maybe some of those models to create different ways of establishing equity. But the work we do doesn't have to be super complex. It can be very simple. And maybe it's just as simple as rephrasing some of the language of design from thinking about designing with. I'm sorry. Oh my God, I spoiled it. This is supposed to no. This is supposed to be worded so well. Maybe it's just maybe it's just shifting our thinking to designing with our communities and not designing for our communities. There we go. I got it. Yes, awesome. Thanks for that, Heart. Everything was going so smoothly. I know. Yeah, and so happy to leave now a little bit of time for folks to provide any questions, but just really thank you so much for inviting me to have a chat with you all today, sharing a little bit about methodology, a little bit about examples and inspiration. And we're just so excited to do the work we do. And we partner with educational institutions, companies, to talk about just different models that we can establish relationships with each other that's more equitable and more mindful. And so definitely recommend you to learn more about us at qtbipoc.design. We have more content coming up in a few, but we have events to attend, and our spaces are free for LGBTQ plus BIPOC designers. And yeah, you can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. My username is different on Twitter because Twitter has a cap to how long you can have your name. And so, yeah, hopefully they'll change in the future. Accessible design, right? Inclusive design. So yeah, with that, I'll close out of this.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think you gave us so many different, I took like some notes down, like different models, different ideas about how to promote equity. I just think just a really amazing talk. So thank you so much. Do we have questions for Stephen? Guess I should reframe. What questions do we have for Stephen?
Yes. Yes, okay.
Oh, cool. Sorry, I wasn't sure. Thank you for coming in to have your talk. It was really great hearing what you're up to. I was especially interested in the part about diversifying who is doing the work of design. And I wanted to ask you, how in your practice does, I guess, race-based DEI overlap with class-based DEI? And I ask that because I often am interpreted by well-meaning people who care about diversity by my racial identity first. And I'm seen to represent Latinos who I can't really speak for. So I definitely add something to the room just because I have the racial background that I do. But it feels often to me that there's work to be done in how much diversity there is within racial groups that we're now seeking to include more. And I was wondering if you could talk about how that's shown up in your work at all.
Yeah, great question. So absolutely, right? As we talk about intersectional identities, so many layers, not just race. We have socioeconomic background, education, sexual preferences, identities, different ways that people label those as they wish. Just so many different layers. In a nutshell, I would say the more we can recognize our own biases and where we come from, we can recognize and bring to the table what we can offer. And when we can also identify where our gaps are, we can also invite other people who may have different experiences. And so our work is actually on establishing, creating more diverse cultures through equitable cultures. And so we have a firm belief that if the space is not inviting for other people to share different ideas and perspectives, it's going to come in one door and out the other, right? And so we've been pushing for a lot of folks to just invite different perspectives at all times. And sometimes it's a little unsettling, but the more we can practice sitting in discomfort, we become more attuned when it shows up. And actually, we invite it in more and we celebrate it more. Sometimes it might show up as very small nuances where we do start pushing away diverse perspectives. And so really the practice shows up as how do we uphold this within our own work that we do in the day-to-day. But even just the way we change the pronoun use is really important. Shifting from I and me, or sorry, shifting from we and you to I and me when we talk about our designs and our perspectives on design. I think da 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 da, right? Based on my experiences in XYZ versus we, because ultimately at the end of the day, we can only speak for ourselves, our own lived experiences. They do a lot of this setup within safe therapeutic spaces. So support groups and such like that to shift pronoun use to be our experiences, and also upholding the fact that our experiences are truly valid. Yeah, I think it's just small steps like that we can take in our everyday. If we all did it, the world tomorrow would look like a different place.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to make sure I understand. It seems like what you're getting at is through diverse cultures, we can create a culture that can accommodate more complexity, accommodate and process more complexity, ambiguity, and intersectionality. And right now, as a culture, we might be more focused on like certain kinds of complexity, but the work itself of creating a more diverse culture increases our capacity to do that kind of work of inclusivity.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
And
To what
the
you're saying?
one, yeah, that and one more on top of it is how open we are to the concept of diversity. Sometimes we say, right, we want it, but when it shows up in the room and it doesn't align with our ideas, we don't sit well with it and we oftentimes push it away.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a two-pronged approach of one, how do we bring it into the space, right? But also the second part is how do we truly accept it? How do we embrace it? Does that help?
Yeah, definitely. Thank
Okay,
you.
awesome.
The point about diverse cultures was really helpful.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? Also, thank you, Jake, so much for doing so much awesome interpretation. Sometimes my English goes like through a roller coaster. And so thank you so much for being able to interpret and translate my words into beautiful sign language. Much appreciated.
You're very welcome.
If there are no other questions, I'll hit on something, Stephen,
Yes.
if you don't mind. You said something that kind of really resonated with me about sort of perfectionism and how perfectionism sort of implies that there is a single source of truth, but then that means that perfectionism cannot exist because there is no single source of truth, and like how that relates to the sort of diversity of the cultures that we create and the norms that we've had. And I have never heard anybody talk about perfectionism in that way. And somebody who is like combating that on a personal level, that just really like hit me in a different way. And I'm just curious if you have like additional thoughts about kind of like shifting the norms, both like individually, but also like as a larger group, in how we might like reframe perfectionism or other types of norms. I don't know, to help us like get out of this kind of one note mindset.
Absolutely. Yes. It's perfection and design are like so intertwined. And when I've mentioned a few times, like it's resonated with a tremendous amount of people. And myself, like I'm definitely a recovering perfectionism as well, perfectionist. And a few like things. First is how we hold space for ourselves is how we hold space for others. How critical of ourselves we are, that is how critical we become of others. How much we hold perfectionism in our own space is exactly how we hold perfectionism in others. And so until we are able to dismantle and create equity within ourselves, one way through addressing perfectionism, we can try to do all these things in the outside world, but it's always going to go into these things we're comfortable with, which is how we hold space for ourselves. And so also think about, as we do work for us, it will automatically trigger outwards. And in this work of equity, we're so focused, right, on everything that's outside of us. Rarely do we think about work that's inside of us. And so to bring it back, when we do the work inside of us, it will come out, it will be expressed. And the second tip of perfectionism is to allow more different perspectives as it shows up, right? And so in the work that we do, before we, shove it away or say, this is bad, how are ways that we can, what they call, respect the different ideas, right? And so respect could be, I put it down somewhere, right? I note it down somewhere, I save it, right? Rather than throwing things away. And so it's really, I think that's a really easy word for people to understand. And we say also like respect your emotions as it shows up in all these different aspects. That's like a whole nother rabbit hole. But as you respect different ideas that shows up within yourself, I think that practice will also allow you to hold space for other different ideas that other people bring into the space as well. But again, it's not a one size fits all solution. That's where a lot of people struggle with. They're like, just tell me what to do. But I think it's, if I just put it simply, it's becoming kinder to yourself, being so less harder on yourself. And so this is a lot of my practice in mindfulness. And so I've sat in like countless silent meditation. I'm like, give me, salvation, give me, inner peace. And sometimes this practice, right, of trying to dismantle something can also turn into perfectionism. So in the practice of trying to dismantle perfectionism, we're like, this must be a certain way. We get so attached to it. And this practice within Buddhism that's really beautiful is impermanence, meaning nothing is ever forever. And that concepts that we hold gently flow in, gently flow out. And so what might exist as dismantling perfectionism today can also be very different tomorrow. And ultimately, it's just listening to what our soul truly needs and nourishes from. And so the last point, and I'll I'll close here, is how we know when we're dismantling perfection within us is when we feel a sense of calmness wash over us when we approach work, when we approach iterations of our work, when we approach different ideas of our work. And when that calmness shows up, it means we are providing peace, providing respect to whatever's coming up, giving it time and attention. And so as we work through different concepts and projects, work, whatever shows up, ask yourself, when does peace show up? And how can you be kinder to yourself?
I appreciate that. Well, I see we're at the hour. Stephen, do you have any closing thoughts for us, given that you're our last speaker of the series?
Yeah. Oh my God, so much weight on my shoulder.
Sorry, no, don't mean to add the pressure.
I will add one more thing, like an anecdote I will share with like perfectionism, especially as we talk about like colonialism and how different countries took over different countries. One fact that I learned like a few weeks ago that I was like, oh, this is interesting, was how perfectionism was used to put European settlers on the forefront. So in terms of discovering different lands, right, we had different indigenous territories also spread across many different lands, and they were expert sailors, expert travelers. Yet when Columbus and other folks arrived, they saw this was happening and they said, no, that's impossible because I have a way of traveling. I have a way of exploring and they're not doing my way. So what they've done must be a mistake. What they've done must be not accurate, not right. What they've done must be a lie. And so perfectionism was used since early on, especially in colonialism, to dismantle different forms of ideas and thoughts. And unfortunately, what happened from it was we lost centuries and centuries of knowledge and intelligence when we put that one way was above all, this way that we must explore the world. And so sometimes, like when we show up in different things and allowing different people to have perspectives, we might not understand the impact it might have like hundreds and hundreds of years from now. And so while it might look like we're just like rolling the snowball just a little bit today, oh my gosh, you might have a gigantic snowman, snow woman, snow person at the end of the day. And the last note I will leave is, along with the little impact, if we all make a little change every single day, just little by little, tomorrow, next week, next month will be a whole new place. And so not to let yourself be so weighed down by just all this work there is to do. If we all took just little steps, tomorrow's going to be amazing. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you, Jake, our Rise interpreter. I will hang back here if anybody wants to hang out or